believe in the statement that I just quoted, and believe that, Israel has a right to exist and to flourish, and also that what's going on often in the conflict is the scapegoating of Israel, and it is a making excuses for a lot of what happens in that region. But then you have another part of the community which believes that anything associated with the West and anything associated with even implicitly or minimally with the U.S. is necessarily white, necessarily an oppressor, and necessarily something that should be the object of our scorn. Okay, so when they look at Israel, they see white-looking people, and then many of them project and say, if this is a country full of white-looking people, then it follows that they must be the oppressor in relation to the Palestinian people, and therefore we have to stand on the side of the Palestinians against the oppressor, right? Now, it turns out that this is a very superficial, shallow way of viewing a conflict, let alone the world in general. It also happens to be not the case that Israel is majority Ashkenazi, it's actually majority Sephardic, but that being said, it is wrong to automatically decide where your alliances will lie simply based upon the skin color of a population. Okay, so next slide. So, I'm going to go back to where I left off in my personal story. I graduated almost 3 years ago, in 2015, and after I graduated, I moved to New York, and I joined the Wall Street Journal for a year-long fellowship with Bret Stephens. While there, I completed a paper on the topic of Israel and millennials, what works, what doesn't, and how to make it better. I was struggling with how to build affinity for Israelis among millennials, and so I completed this 82-page thesis, and it really captures a lot of some of the ideas that I'm going to talk about moving forward. Next slide. Okay, my aha moment. Yes, I'm doing this research. Next slide. Okay, so one of my aha moments, and one of my most important aha moments, was that the negative Israel conversation on campus happens as a result of the framework in which that conversation takes place. So in order to challenge the conversation and to change that conversation from a negative to a positive, we actually have to change the framework. And what is the framework, you may ask? Next slide. Intersectionality. So, we're going to talk about intersectionality. Again, keep in mind what I said about Dr. King's earlier comments that he made about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and being color-consumed. Next slide. Great. Next slide. Okay, so intersectionality was invented, a term invented by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. She was a legal student. And she wanted to give us a term that helped underscore what it was like to experience intersecting forms of discrimination. So, for example, if you were a woman of color, there was legislation dealing with, let's say I experienced discrimination as a woman, and let's say I experienced discrimination as a person of color, but there wasn't legislation to deal with both of those things. So she came up with the term, intersectionality, to actually have a legal framework for how to deal with when identities intersect and you can experience discrimination across those intersecting lines. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the establishment of intersectionality in its original form, and even Kimberly Crenshaw has stated that the term has been misused in the present time. Next slide. Okay, great. This is the part where the words get jumbled, so I have to unpack it for you. Okay, so intersectionality started out as the statement: it is possible to experience discrimination across multiple intersecting identities. That's how it started out. Okay, but today it has become something entirely different. Today it has come to mean that only those with grievances, whether real or perceived, are valuable. This is how it has come to affect our conversation. And secondly, you are not valued if you are perceived to be privileged. Okay? If this is sounding familiar to you, there's a reason for that. So it started out as just a simple statement. You are capable of experiencing discrimination across intersecting identities, right? And that statement has been transformed into an overarching cosmic system for figuring out which peoples are privileged and therefore have virtue, and which peoples are underprivileged and therefore have no virtue, or vice versa. Next slide. Okay, so we have gone from the civil rights movement to the of you are familiar with the Women's March controversy in Farrakhan. Okay, so all of you. So we know what happened a few weeks ago. Tamika Mallory had been sitting at a Louis Farrakhan sermon where he railed and railed and railed against Jews. And, people really in the mainstream were asking her, why won't you condemn it? And she had a very difficult time condemning it. And we were all confused how someone who considers themselves to be progressive would stand with a guy who's rabidly anti-Semitic. And as it turns out, and she said this in her response, that like intersectional coalition building requires one, according to her, to stand next to organizations or stand next to people that look like her and that have been involved in certain spaces where she has been involved in. So next slide. Okay, so ultimately this framework creates a lot of discord, division, and hatred. Next slide. So we need a better framework that fosters real human connection in previously polarized spaces. Okay, so you can't see what that says, but this slide is a title of my theory of change that I developed at the Wall Street Journal on how to have better conversations with millennials about Israel. This theory is called the theory of enchantment. Okay, it's an alternative framework to intersectionality, and again, the goal is to create a better framework in previously polarized spaces. Next slide. So this is just a brief history of the theory of enchantment. This is a picture of a page out of the research that I did. Let me back up a bit and tell you how I developed the theory of enchantment. I realized that being in the space of Israel engagement, the collective pro-Israel community were asking two wrong questions, or they were starting with two fundamentally different or flawed assumptions. The first assumption was that most millennials care about Israel. Most millennials don't care about Israel. They don't care about Sri Lanka. They don't care about any other random country that isn't in their immediate field of experience. So they don't care about Israel. That's the first flawed assumption. The second assumption that I think that we were making that was sort of flawed is we were asking fundamentally the question, how do you stop anti-Semitism? Which is a noble question, right? A very noble question. That's how I got started in this space. But what we should have been asking, instead of how do we stop anti-Semitism, we should have been asking how do we actually get people to fall in love with Israelis? And these are two totally different questions. The first question is the question of how do you get people to stop hating? The second question is the question of how do you get people to start loving? And this is really the essence of the difference between the theory of intersectionality and the theory of enchantment. The theory of enchantment starts by asking how do we get people to start loving? And by re-changing the frame into that type of question, I found that Jews and non-Jews, people from all over, were much more interested in that question. So I started to ask, if I want millennials to fall in love with Israelis, then I have to ask, what are we already in love with? And how do I use that as a conduit to get them to fall in love with Israelis? And for me, that particular study took me to studying pop culture. So next slide. Great, Beyonce. Okay, so I started to ask, words are cut off. Why are we attracted to who we're attracted to? Like I started to be like, why am I so obsessed with Beyonce? Like, and what does that say about me and my human psychology and whatnot? Okay, next slide. And what does that teach us about how to get people to fall in love with Israelis? And it could be Beyonce, it could be Disney movies, it could be, Game of Thrones, it could be whatever. But I started to probe my own personal interests and try to figure out what that meant about myself. Okay, next slide. Great, you can't read it. Okay, so after I studied all the things that I was into, so I started studying Beyonce lyrics, I started studying Nike as an organization and as a company that has really gained an incredibly large audience. I started studying all these corporations that have incredibly large consumer bases. And I started asking, what is the thing that each of them are doing? What do they have in common? And how can I learn how to take that and apply it to this particular topic? So I started to realize, for example, women are very much attracted to Beyonce because Beyonce says, who run the world? Girls. Right? So we see ourselves, our potential, reflected in that content. Athletes often tend to be very much attracted to Nike because Nike puts out messages like just do it, messages just like find your greatness, telling athletes about their human potential. So, this is the grand rule of the theory of enchantment. You create content where your audience can see themselves and their potential reflected in the content. Next slide. So, instead of asking who has power and who doesn't, which is a fundamental question that intersectionalist theory posits, next slide, ask how you can empower everyone. Next slide. Okay, so you can't read this either. So, just before we get into because I'm going to get into the Israeli-Palestinian bit, but before we do that, I want us to continue to explore this framework within the context of African American literature. Okay, this framework of intersectionality versus the theory of enchantment. I'm sure that all or most of you are familiar with both Ta-Nehisi Coates. Yes, how many of you are familiar? Okay, good. And I hope all of you are familiar with Maya Angelou. Less people, but still, still good. Okay, so I want to take you guys through a case study of Ta-Nehisi Coates versus Maya Angelou. And I'm taking you through this case study because it's important to note the differences and the way in which they approach the human condition. Because the way they approach the human condition will determine where you are and where you come to with regard to everything, and especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay? So, the next slides you will not be able to read. That's okay. I'm going to read the quotes from their books for you. Great. All right. So, these quotes are by Ta-Nehisi Coates. They come from his book, Between the World and Me, and they also come from an essay that he published in Atlanta magazine recently. First quote says this: "And now when I measure this fear against the boldness that the white masters of the galaxy imparted to their own children, I am ashamed." That's the first quote. The second quote is this: "The passive power of whiteness, that bloody heirloom which cannot ensure mastery of all events, but can conjure most of them." Keep in mind the comment from Dr. King in 1968 when he talked about people who are color consumed as I read these quotes. The third and final quote by Ta-Nehisi Coates is, quote, "Remember that this consciousness can never ultimately be racial, it must be cosmic." Now, if you read Between the World and Me, or if you have read Between the World and Me, Coates comes away from his experiences seeing whiteness as this all-pervasive, powerful, cosmic, bloody heirloom, quote-unquote, that cannot ensure mastery of all events, but can conjure most of them. For Coates, racism, next slide, even though you won't be able to read it. Oh, yes you will. For Coates, racism is not the product of human individual choice, but cosmic, ubiquitous, and all-powerful. Okay, it is everywhere, it's inescapable, it's amorphous, it's nebulous, and it's not like it is the product of individual human choice. It's inescapable. This is the lens through which Ta-Nehisi Coates views the world. Now, by removing human choice in the equation, Coates ends up actually objectifying the humans in the conversation. Because as it turns out, you cannot dehumanize someone and have that person take accountability for their actions. You can't say that racism is this all-pervasive, nebulous, amorphous, cosmic thing, and at the same time ask white people to take responsibility for their actions, because you think that white people are predisposed to do what they do, right? So that's a contradiction. Okay, next slide. Again, stuff you can't read, but I'm going to read it for you. Now, I'm going to contrast Ta-Nehisi Coates with Maya Angelou, who is my personal spirit animal. May she rest in peace. And you should read all of her books if you haven't. Okay, so Maya Angelou, in her own words, says, quote, "It is impossible to struggle for civil rights, equal rights for blacks, without including whites. Because equal rights, fair play, justice are all like the air. We all have it or none of us have it. That is the truth of it." That's the first quote. Second quote is this: "I speak to the black experience, but I am always talking about the human condition." Third quote, and this is, I think, a super important quote: "Until blacks and whites see each other as brother and sister, we will not have parity. It's very clear." I'm going to read that one again. "Until blacks and whites see each other as brother and sister, we will will not have parity. It is very clear. Next slide. At the bottom of Angelo's writing is an unquenchable love for the human being, black and white. There is personal choice. There is autonomy. There is the human condition in her language and in her approach and in the lens through which she sees this race relations in America. Next slide. So this is what we have. Two competing visions that are at odds with each other ultimately. And these two competing visions make up two very different frameworks for how one chooses to see the world. Whether you're talking about how one chooses to address domestic conditions or foreign relations conditions, in this case the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first approach is about objectification. It objectifies, it dehumanizes, it stereotypes, it's objectification. The second approach is represented by Maya Angelou, and it's ultimately empathy for the human being, and empathy for the individual. These are the two competing visions that we as a generation are struggling to find out and figure out where we stand in that, within that dichotomy. Next slide. Okay, and now to the elephant in the room. Keeping all of that history and all that context in mind, let's discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is my favorite, it's not my favorite topic, but it's one of my favorite topics. Okay, next slide. Again, our approach, being taken from a page out of Maya Angelou's handbook. Ask how you can empower everyone. This is the new framework. Next slide, let me pause and say that for those of you who would be interested, I work for a company called Jerusalem Youth, and we provide educational primers on the conflict, so if you want that, come see me afterwards. Okay, next slide. Okay, so, theory of enchantment, themes and principles of conflict transformation. I'm going to have to be reading a lot of the next slide, so just bear with me. Next slide. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about, again, continuing in the footsteps of Maya Angelou, complexity and imperfection in the human condition. Okay? Complexity and imperfection in the human condition. Next slide. The first principle of the theory of enchantment when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is quite simply that Israelis and Palestinians are human beings, not political abstractions. And I know that one of the things that happens on college campuses when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the communities in these conflicts immediately becomes objectified, they become viewed through the lens of political abstraction, which is very unhealthy from the beginning. Next slide. Who here represents or recognizes this quote? Oh, come on. Okay. So, this, for those of you who may not know, is a quote by Kendrick Lamar from his song DNA. He says, I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA. Right? Saying that he has all of these things within him as a human being. And as a human being, he is complicated, he is layered, he has duality, he has the capacity to do good and the capacity to do evil. He has power and poison and pain and joy. What it means to be a human being is ultimately to be a complex, living, breathing creature that has to wrestle with this thing we call the human condition. Okay, next slide. Oh, you can kind of read that. Okay, so this is a text from Amos Oz, who's a very famous Israeli author, from his book, A Tale of Love and Darkness. I highly recommend that you read it if you haven't. But he says, and this really underscores, again, the point about human complexity, quote, he considered all human beings to be reckless children who brought great disappointment and suffering upon themselves and each other. All of us trapped in an unending, unsubtle comedy that would generally end badly. All roads led to suffering. Consequently, virtually everyone in Papa's view deserved compassion. Next slide. So, what's the corollary conclusion of this principle? We want to reject, from the outset, any dehumanizing language that objectifies, demonizes, or stereotypes Israelis and Palestinians, because we're talking about human beings, not political abstractions. Next slide. Second theme, trauma and extremism in the human condition. Another theme that comes up in sectarian conflicts. Next slide. We have to keep in mind that both Israeli and Palestinian communities have experienced violence, pain, fear, and trauma that ultimately need healing. Next slide. Well, you can't really see that, but this is a picture of the toxic life cycle of trauma. Trauma often leads to fear, which often leads to extremism, which often leads to more trauma, which often leads to fear, which often leads to more extremism. Next slide. Okay, who wants to read this quote? Yes.
How could a Jew stay balanced? You seem to be either on the edge of destruction or redemption, the world's great victims or victors. A nation of manic depressives, we had a sense of abandonment. I'd once read a story about children sold to medieval circuses and turned into freaks. Their legs, bound in blocks, remained stunted, while their torsos grew to normal size. Heads, placed in hourglasses, adapted to the shape of the curves. We too were being transformed into freaks, ghettoized and demonized until we turned grotesque with rage.
Thank you. What is your name?
Adisa?
Adisa, thank you for reading. This is from a book by Yossi Klein Halevi, another famous Israeli author. The name of the book is called Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, and I included this quote because it illustrates the process of extremism. He, in particular, was the son of a Holocaust survivor. And growing up in Brooklyn, here in New York, he felt abandoned, he felt ostracized, he felt like people didn't care about him, and didn't care about his own community. And so in the early stages of his life, he turned inward. He ended up joining an extremist group, and he talks about the process of that in this particular book. And he says, as you just read, we were being transformed into freaks, ghettoized and demonized until we turned grotesque with rage. Next slide. If trauma is not transformed, it will be transferred. I think this is an Oprah quote, but don't quote me on that, okay? Trauma is not transformed, it will be transferred. Next slide. Okay, who wants to read this one? Yes.
If any human being is told often enough, you are nothing, you count for nothing, you are less than a human being, if any person is told that often enough, the person will finally begin to believe it. And not only will they believe it, they will say, you think I'm nothing, I will show you where nothing is. They will become even lower than what they are being accused of being. They begin to think to themselves, in that case, that their own lives are worth nothing, and that they cannot take their lives. And that they cannot only take their lives, that they can allow others to take their own.
Thank you. Tell us all your name. Joy. Thank you, Joy. We're laughing because I knew her. All right. So this is a great quote by Maya Angelou. It's words to live by. I want you to focus on that last part. They begin to think themselves, in that case, that their own lives are worth nothing, and that they can not only take their lives, they can allow others to take their own. So even as this is a very large teaching in general, it specifically applies to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Has anyone here heard of, thank you, has anyone here heard of Wafa al-Bis? Okay, so you have, so one person has heard of, you have as well. So Wafa al-Bis, for those of you who do not know, attempted a suicide attack. I want to say 2002. And after she attempted the suicide attack, members of the Israeli government interviewed her parents, and they interviewed members of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which had sent her out on the attack. And in the course of these interviews, they discovered that Wafa al-Bis had actually been abused by her father for a month and a half. And Wafa al-Bis had actually attempted to commit suicide twice before she did this suicide attempt in Israel. And they found out that Wafa al-Bis, this third suicide attempt, was more of a suicide attempt than any political statement. Wafa al-Bis did not feel that she was enough. Wafa al-Bis had been abused by her father, by her own family, and as a result, she lacked her own sense of self-esteem, and she then went out to commit suicide. If anyone's interested in learning more about her story and other stories of suicide bombers or attempted suicide bombers, there's a great book called The Myth of the Martyr, which unpacks the human psychology behind suicide bombers. But she was someone who did not feel worthy, who did not feel enough, and as a result, actually not only tried to allow her life to be taken, right, as the quote from Maya Angelou just stated, but was willing to take the lives of others. Next slide. So therefore, when we criticize people, and I know that a lot of criticism happens when we're having conversations about the conflict. When we criticize, we should do so to uplift and empower each other. Never to tear down, never to destroy. This is the second principle of a theory of enchantment. If a person is not valued, he or she ultimately cannot develop character. So when we criticize, again, do so to uplift and empower. Next slide. This is a quote from James Baldwin. I'm not going to read it because we're trying to get through. Next slide. Okay, another case study, Wafa Idris. How many of you are familiar with Wafa Idris? Anyone? Okay, so a few people, yes? Wafa Idris was the first female Palestinian suicide bomber. She, unfortunately, was successful in her suicide bombing. Wafa Idris came from a family where she had, unfortunately, had a miscarriage, and they didn't look too well upon people having miscarriages. She was also left barren and left alone by her husband. Her husband left her after he realized that she couldn't get pregnant. And as a result of these two things, Wafa Idris was pushed by her own family to commit what was essentially a retroactive honor killing. And this is related to the principle that I just stated because, again, if people are not valued, if people are not shown a sense of esteem, if people are not given a sense of worthiness, they will not only go out to take the lives of another person, they will feel okay to allow their own lives to be taken. And this is what happened to Wafa Idris. Next slide. I don't actually know if it's going to play. Can we try it? Okay, so is there volume here?
Every emotion is connected and comes from somewhere. And just being aware of it. Being aware of it in everyday life puts you at such an advantage. You realize that, someone's racist toward you. It's not even about you. It ain't about you. It's about their upbringing and what happened to them and how they led them to this point. Most bullies bully. It's happened. Oh, you got bullied kids, so you're trying to bully me. I understand. And once I understand that, instead of reacting to that with anger, I can provide a softer landing. And maybe, oh man, are you okay? I was just saying, there was a lot of fights in our neighborhood that started with, what you looking at? Are you looking at me? You looking at me? And then you realize, you think I see you. You're in a space where you're hurting and you think I see you, so you don't want me to look at you. And you don't want me to see you in such a moment. You don't want me to see your pain. So you put on this shell of this tough person that's really willing to fight me and possibly kill me because I looked at you. You know what I'm saying? Like, so knowing that and understanding that changes life completely.
So I wanted to show you guys that clip because I think it underscores on an interpersonal level and in this case on a sectarian level and a geopolitical level how trauma can often breed violence and how that cycle needs to be transcended ultimately. Especially when we're talking about in our conversations about the conflict, whether it's here on campus, whether it's on the street, we have to be able to recognize, where people are coming from, and let's say that people maybe have experienced trauma or insecurity or their own vulnerability. We have to be able to give people the tools to communicate in a way that ultimately helps transcend the conflict. Okay, so next slide. Let's read this one. Okay.
If someone is a bigot, the likeliness that he doesn't love himself is greater than the likeliness that he is merely a psychopath. The latter is easy to deal with. The former is harder. For then, we must force ourselves to respond to hatred with the only thing that can cure it, compassion.
Thank you, darling. Next slide. This is the final theme. This is the most important theme. This is the theme that is underscored in a lot of Maya Angelou's writings. And I encourage you to lead with this theme as you leave this hall tonight. This theme is love, compassion, and restorative justice. Keep this in mind as we discuss the next part. Next slide. So this is the third principle of the theory of enchantment. Everything we do, we try to center in love and compassion. Even when we have, very passionate debates about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about what to do, etc. Everything we do, we want to ultimately center in love and compassion. Next slide. Who wants to read this one? I will call it.
The greatest terror a child can have is that he is not loved, and rejection is the world to a large or small extent has felt rejection. And with rejection comes anger, and with anger some kind of crime and revenge for the rejection. And with the crime, guilt, and there is the story of mankind.
Thank you. This is from my favorite book, East of Eden, again, underscoring that we have to meet people ultimately in love and compassion. We never know what they're going through, even on an interpersonal level, or we're talking about on a geopolitical level, discussing the conflict. Next slide. Okay, so I teach people to do this on campus when they're confronted by, and I know that some of you this week have been confronted by very mean-spirited individuals who will not only disagree with your stance on Israel, but who will be very insulting in their responses to you. We want to try to break that cycle. We want to try to break that cycle of animosity. So I teach students that when they're confronted by someone telling them that, oh, you're a Zionist, you must be an oppressor. Oh, you're a pro-Israel, you must be an oppressor. Right? I teach them to do two things. Number one, say to that person, first of all, I don't know you from Adam, okay? And even though you have made assumptions about me, I will not make assumptions about you. Even though you have prejudged me, which is the definition of prejudice, I will not prejudge you. That's the first thing you do. And then the second thing you do, try it, is you invite that person to Shabbat dinner. Because what you're trying to do is have a rehumanized conversation in an unfortunately hyper-politicized space. Okay? Next slide. We got that. Next slide. So, the goal of this, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is not to get everyone to agree with every single position you have on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm sure we all disagree on aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The goal is to bring back empathy and compassion, even in the midst of profound disagreement. And ultimately, by exhibiting civility, when confronted with hatred, we will be able to exhibit humanity. Next slide. What we're ultimately trying to do is transcend the us versus them binary and reject the us versus them narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We want to go from reconciliation to restoration to transformation. Next slide. We can skip that. Next slide. Okay, so I want to just give you a quick story about what restoration looks like and what we mean by restorative justice. This is a true story. A couple months ago at the University of Florida, Richard Spencer spoke, and there was a protest that naturally occurred outside of his speech. And a guy named Randy Furness, who was the white guy, wanted to go see him speak, and he was a neo-Nazi, he was a skinhead, and he wanted to see him speak. But in order to do so, he had to go through the protesters. And when he got near the protesters, they started spitting on him, they started, spitting at him, hitting him, cursing at him, etc. And this one man named Anthony Courtney, who was totally taken aback by the presence of this neo-Nazi skinhead in front of him, had no idea what to do, and so he did the only thing in that moment that he was moved to do, and he hugged him. And in the midst of hugging him, he asked him 3 times, "Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me?" And at this point, Randy Furness, the neo-Nazi, also has no idea what to do because this guy, who he's been taught to hate his entire life, is completely embracing him. And so he does the only thing that he feels moved to do at the time, which is to say he hugs him back. And he says to him, "I don't know." And this exchange sparks an entire series of changes within Randy Furness. He's engaged by other members of the African American community. He eventually gets rid of his neo-Nazi affiliations, and he continues to engage the African American community to this day. This is what restorative justice looks like. Restorative justice is interested in the restoration of all human beings involved. Next slide. We can skip that. Next slide. So, ultimately, what we're trying to do, we're trying to transcend and reject the us versus them narrative of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Next slide. I'm just going to go through a few examples in Israel where this sort of approach is very much promoted and underscored. There's an open house peace center in Ramla, Israel, where they deliberately take young Jews and young Arabs and put them together and have them engage in different programs together from youth to ensure that there is good affinity and good human relations and good reconciliation fostered between the two. Next slide. As Dr. King once famously said, ultimately, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Next slide. This is one of my favorite stories, especially because it's specifically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Roots is an organization, an NGO, that was co-founded by an Israeli and a Palestinian, both of whom live in the West Bank. And they both got together and decided to try to create reconciliation and foster reconciliation, specifically between Jews living in Judea and Samaria and Palestinians. Next slide. So, this is a quote from Ali Abu Awad, who's the Palestinian peace activist and the co-founder of Roots. Note that what he's talking about right now is not political, but emotional in nature, and again reflective of the human condition. He said, an Israeli mother who had lost her son held my mother's hand, and both of them cried wordlessly. He said, it was the first time in my life that I saw the other side as human beings. I saw different representatives of the Jewish people, of Judaism, and of Israelis. It had a huge impact on me. Next slide. And this is from the Jewish co-founder, Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger. He says, quote, to meet the other, to bring the other into my soul, to identify with the other. I had to make room in my soul for another truth, the Palestinian truth. That doesn't make my connection to this land any less strong or true, but it has to be balanced by an understanding of another truth. Next slide. And this is an image from an article in the Times of Israel. Fascinating thing happened. By the way, the guy with the kippah is Yossi Klein Halevi. Fascinating thing happened a couple years ago. An American imam went to Yossi Klein Halevi and said to him, listen, we know absolutely nothing about Zionism. They teach us in mosques that Zionism is bad, Zionism is evil, and we want to know from the Jewish perspective, what is Zionism? Because we know it has much more to do with just the Holocaust. We know it has to do with the national strivings of the Jewish people, which has been a part of Judaism for a long time, but we want to be taught from the Jewish people and from the Jewish perspective. Next slide. And this is a quote, from that piece written by David Horowitz. This has been happening since 2013. Dozens of young U.S. Muslim leaders have traveled to Israel to learn about Judaism, Zionism, and Israel. This is the full story of their high-risk, taboo-shattering initiative, a vital step, they hope, toward Muslim-Jewish healing in America and beyond. So these are some of the initiatives that have been going on, again, since as early as 2013, and they continue to exist within Israeli society. And I think that if we bring those approaches and those frameworks and try to apply it to how we talk about the ins and outs of the conflict on campus, it'll be a much more transformative, much more empathetic conversation for the students involved. So, next slide. Let's sum up. I don't know why that's cut off. Let's sum up. The first principle, Israelis and Palestinians are human beings, not political abstractions. Do not demonize, do not stereotype, do not otherize, do not try to place people in compartmentalized boxes. As human beings, we all have fears and insecurities and vulnerabilities, and some of us have traumas that need to be worked out. Keep that in mind when you're talking to a person. You're talking to a full, whole person, right? DNA. Think about it. Okay, second principle. When we criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy. You want to criticize anti-Semitism within Palestinian political culture? Do so. But do so ultimately because you want Palestinians to flourish, not because you want to tear Palestinians down. Same thing goes for Israel. You want to criticize policies of the Israeli government? Go for it. But do so in order to see Israelis flourish, not because you want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. There's a difference. This is about centering our approach and understanding our intentions. Third principle, everything we do, we root in love and compassion. The goal is to bring back empathy. The goal is to bring back reconciliation. The goal is not to have everyone agree on every single one of your points. It's to bring back compassion even in the midst of profound disagreement. Next slide. Resources. For those of you who may be interested in some of the books and pop culture references that I pulled from, next slide, here's a list of books. If you want to read it, I highly recommend that you do. A Tale of Love and Darkness by Amos Oz, Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, Tiny Beautiful Things, Israel Concise History, East of Eden, As We Forgive, Stories of Reconciliation from Rwanda, Braving the Wilderness, Between the World and Me. You should still read Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a well-written book. Just read Maya Angelou as you read him. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and David the Divided Heart. Next slide. Films and shows. I have to rep my own company. Jerusalem U, we make films and documentaries about the Israeli people. We made a film called Beneath the Helmet. Makonnen, Journey of an African Jew. When the Smoke Clears, which is about trauma in the IDF, etc. Freedom Riders, which is my favorite movie of all time. I watch it like 20 times a year. Tree of Life, Moana. Yes, there is a Moana connection to all of this, and I can answer that if anyone has that question in Q&A. Inside Out, The Power of Vulnerability, Jay-Z interview with the New York Times, and Wonder Woman. Next slide. And I'm so sorry. Peace and reconciliation groups if you want to get involved with peace and reconciliation groups in Israel. You have Open House in Ramla, Israel. You have the Arava Institute, which works to bring Palestinians, Israelis, and Jordanians together to work on agricultural projects and projects that help the environment. The Jewish Arab Shared Society Education, the Shalom Harmon Institute, the Perez Center for Peace, Roots, and the Muslim Leadership Initiative, as started by Yossi Klein Halevi. Next slide. Follow us. Wow, that's so bad. That was supposed to be like a promo. Follow us on Instagram and on YouTube and all the various platforms so you can follow us. I'm Chloé Valdary. I represent an incredible film production company called Jerusalem U. Thank you for joining.
So we're going to turn to a Q&A. So if you have a question, I'm going to be choosing people and just make sure that your questions are a bit short because we're short in time and I'm sure many people have a lot to ask. So no like statements and stuff. I'm sorry, just try to keep it concise for this time. So sure, Joy.
So I wanted to ask you because I've seen Moana like at least 20 times.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, like, in your opinion, what is the connection with the film Moana with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So, great question. The question was, what is the connection between Moana and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? So, there's no connection between Moana and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a connection between Moana and the concept of restorative justice, which is a framework I think we can use to approach the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay, so just by show of hands, how many of you have seen Moana? Okay, this will be a spoiler alert for those of you who have not. I apologize, but it's your fault. You should have seen it by now. And still go see it. It's still worth seeing. Okay, so I'm going to set the stage for all you people who haven't seen it yet. In the story of Moana, Moana has to go restore the heart of Tefiti, who is this beautiful green goddess who has disappeared off of the island. And she has been replaced with this lava-breathing goddess who is the enemy of all people on the island, and she's just crazy and yelling and super scary. I actually showed that clip in another presentation. But anyway, so Moana finds herself going to attack this evil lava goddess. Her name is Tekah, okay? And there's really like an incredible Passover Moses moment in this clip because she's walking and the water starts to part all of a sudden, and she has the heart in her hand, and she's approaching Tekah. And you know, Tekah is all crazy and like yelling at her and just going, rah. But then Moana like chills out, and she's like, I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you, but this does not define you. And in the most incredible moment of this movie, Moana has the realization, and the realization that she has is that Tekah, the evil lava goddess, and Tefiti, the green goddess, are the same goddess. And the heart, the love, the compassion, etc., the empathy was stolen from her, was taken out of her, and that's why she turned into Tekah. And it's only by restoring the heart that she becomes once more Tefiti. So that is the way in which Moana teaches us restorative justice in the Disney way.
I'm going to use my position to ask a question. It's more like campus related, since this is the atmosphere, but we face along campus something that's called the anti-normalization policy, which means, I hope I'm not butchering it for them, because I am not them, but often anti-Israel movements claim that they will not have conversations, at least not in any official way, with Zionists for various different explanations. And what you are suggesting for us to do is to have those conversations and to engage in more, even though in friendlier way or empathetic ways to solve this. But how would we address this to begin with if
you're not
can't talk?
So my understanding is that, you can correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that many of you just this week have had exchanges with individuals who will be like, they'll have that initial conversation, they'll just be like, they'll like insult you, right?
Yeah.
And I think that even in the moment when they insult you, there's an opportunity there, because there's an opportunity to frame your response in such a way that might pique their interest. And I would say, it's very hard to do this, but I would say, if I was insulted by someone, I would be like, again, you're making assumptions about me, but I will not make assumptions about you. You will prejudge me, but I will not prejudge you, even though you're doing so. And if that actually gets them, interested, I'd say continue with invite them to a less politicized space you could actually talk. Since anti-normalization is like saying we won't have formal discussions with you, I would also say try to work on individuals, because I think that you will find that there's always a possibility in having conversations with individuals, even if they want to meet with you in secret, which is weird, but I think there's always that opportunity. So unfortunately, the onus is upon us to have to prod and have to try to be always ready to engage, even when they're not so open to it.
Anyone else? Ryan?
You mentioned this is not your favorite topic. I'm just curious, what is your favorite topic?
The question.
He asked me, he said, because I said this is not my favorite topic, what is my favorite topic? It's a good question. This is definitely one of my favorite topics. I do this for a living, and my job is to try to tell the human interest stories of Israelis and bring them to a larger audience, and I love doing that. But really, I think my favorite topic comes from this, which is all about trying to have conversations with empathy, trying to recenter empathy in our conversations, whether as a nation or whether as students debating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think that I have a tremendous amount of passion for that. Is there a follow-up?
Yeah, on that.
Okay.
Well, preceding this event, we received a lot of unfriendly messages, emails, and you as an African-American woman coming here and being a Zionist, some of them were bananas and just crazy. And I'm curious if you have a response to that, or if you can afford us a way to maybe take that in or even respond to it.
Well, so when it comes to social media, for example, and people speaking to me on social media in, let's say, very insulting terms, there are some people who I will not engage just because it's fruitless to do so. For example, don't freak out, but one time there was a death threat that I had, and I would never engage that person because that would be crazy. He wants to kill me. So
yeah, let's be.
I think that's sort of when it's beyond the pale. But I think you can use your judgment in terms of if you think this person is in a headspace that is ready for engagement. But at the same time, there are people who I just disagree with, right? Who I will totally engage, depending upon whether or not I think they're in a position to engage. So, for example, there was this woman on Twitter who engaged me, started calling me all these names because I was a Zionist, said I was an oppressor, etc. And I said to her, listen, I am interested in figuring out how both of these communities, the Israeli community and the Palestinian community, can get to a place in a space where trauma can be healed where there could be reconciliation and where we can start having conversations that actually uplift both communities, given that both communities have experienced what they've experienced. And I said, if you're not interested in that, that's okay, but I'm gonna go move on. But be well. And she responded by continuing to say the same things, but what's interesting is that in that moment, it didn't have emotional weight. And they usually have emotional weight. Like some of the insults that get thrown around usually have emotional weight, and it didn't that time. Because I was responding to her by rejecting the framework. And her framework was Israeli versus Palestinian. And I reject that framework from the outset and said, this is not my framework. I want to see how we can talk about both communities and uplift both communities. But at the end of her statement, what was interesting is that she told me, be well. And it was the first time someone who was, rapidly anti-Israel and very much against what they perceived me to be, it was the first time that person wished me be well. And I have no reason to think that it wasn't genuine. So I thought that meant something, and that moved the needle just a little bit. So that's my personal experience. I would say use your judgment when it comes to figuring out who's a troll and who's not a troll.
Yeah, this was a great lecture. I hope
Thank
to see a lot more of you in the years to come. Can you tell us about your meeting with Sarah Silverman?
Yes. Okay. Question is, could I tell you guys about meeting Sarah Silverman? So 2 weeks ago I was in LA. Can't believe this happened. 2 weeks ago I was in LA, and Sarah Silverman and I had exchanged talking to each other about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on Twitter. And we were talking about the Tamimi family and the details of what do you do in that situation.
I'll do the Tamimi thing.
So the Tamimi, yes. So the Tamimi family, there's this whole situation where this young girl from this Palestinian family is famous for being provocative against IDF soldiers and filming it so that they can go viral. It's a very famous terrorist-supporting family. But they put out these videos that make this one girl look very chic and very power to the people, without any concern for how is this little girl being brainwashed to believe what she believes and to do what she's doing. So Sarah Silverman sees a video of her doing what she's doing, and it looks like, oh, of course I'm going to stand with Tamimi and the Tamimi family because the visuals are such that it makes it out to be a very specific story. So Sarah Silverman and I had an exchange on Twitter, and I said to her, I think instead of putting your efforts toward this, you should put your efforts toward organizations in Israel that actually foster reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. And I sent her a list of organizations that do that, and she was like, yeah! And then she retweeted my thread, and she said in her thread, Israelis, Palestinians, and anyone else interested in the conflict, read this entire thread, which was a huge, endorsement. And then she followed me. And then I'm texting my friend, I'm playing my clip all of this because I can't believe what's happening. And my friend goes, you should direct message her. And I'm like, yeah, I should. So I sent her a direct message and I was like, listen, if you're ever in the New York area and you want to continue to discuss this, I'm buying coffee, let's do it. And she responded and she was like, absolutely, yeah, let's do it. So when I found out I was going to be in LA for work, I reached out again. And I was like, let's get coffee. And she was like, yeah, let's get coffee. Let's do lunch. She upgraded from coffee to lunch. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? And it's crazy because an hour before, I was sitting somewhere drinking coffee. I was telling myself, there's no way this is going to happen. Something's going to be canceled. An appointment is going to have to be changed. But an hour later, we met. We had a 2-hour lunch at Hugo's in LA. And it was pretty awesome. So that's how I got to have lunch with Sarah Silverman.
So when are you going to have lunch with Beyonce?
We'll get there. Baby steps. I fully plan on getting there, by the way. So, yeah, absolutely.
Lindsay? So this was amazing just because it offers a really new perspective to even all pro-Israel advocates on campus, just because we often come at engagement with a very politicized view. Also a personalized view, but not to this extent. But I feel like my question is, have you given this presentation or some variation of this presentation to students or members of the Black community.
You stole my question.
Sorry. And if you have, what was the reaction to that? And if you haven't, have you engaged in some kind of one-on-one conversation with members of the Black community, and what was like meaningful, something that came out?
That's a large question.
Yeah, just-
Okay, so the question is, have I given this presentation or similar presentation to members of the Black community? And if so, what was that like? And if not, have I had one-on-one conversations with members of the Black community about this particular topic? So yes, I have given this presentation to members of the Black community. Particularly, I did a presentation in Ohio. The majority of the people there were African American. I did a slightly different presentation. It was slightly shorter, but it had all the principles. And it had a very similar reception that I'm receiving this evening, which was that this is great, but also that this could be applied to any aspect of one's life. And I'm really discovering that in all of the audiences where I do this, I'm very excited. This weekend, I have my first, I'm doing the Theory of Enchantment presentation in my Brooklyn community, in my Black Brooklyn community, not related to Israel, but just related to how the Theory of Enchantment can help shape how we have difficult conversations in our everyday life. So I'm really excited for that. It's like my first outside of the Israel engagement invitation. So I'll let you know how that goes. But to answer your question, yes, I have done it, and it has been very overall positive, ultimately.
One last question, anyone? Okay. Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, another first class presentation, Chloé, thank you. So, you gave a whole list of Israeli organizations there, and my question is this. So, the Israeli society is democracy. That's the left and the right. Generally on the left, the perspective is that we have to turn territories for peace, and the sense of connection, historical connection, is not as powerful, palpable to the territory of Judea, Samaria, Yehuda, Shomron as they are on the right. The right, the feeling is that this is our sacred homeland, and it can never be given away.
Right.
We don't have the right to even. Do you see, for those people who identify more with what is called the right, or the Gush Leumi, the national bloc in Israel, any reason why the paradigm that you've articulated today cannot be in some way incorporated into the way they operate with, and communicate with the Arab population?
I'm trying to understand your question. Do I see any way in which my paradigm could be used and internalized by the right in Israel?
Yeah, did you see any conflict, I guess?
Oh, so I don't see any conflict just because I'm aware of both right-wing and left-wing groups in Israel that use some aspects of the paradigm I presented this evening. I mean, Yossi Carter-Levy is considered a centrist, but he's center-right. He's compared to
really a centrist.
Compared to Oz, for example, I'd say that he's pretty center-right.
Okay.
So just relative to different people. So I think that he certainly uses certain elements of this, because that's where I got it from. But also Amos Oz uses many different elements of this, and that's where I got it from. I mean, I also think that the right-left dichotomy, insofar as we conceive of it in America, doesn't strictly apply to the Israeli experience, because if you were to just consider Roots, for example, Roots is an organization that's co-founded by a Palestinian who was in an Israeli prison and a settler, and that sort of creates cognitive dissonance, I feel like, for people who stick strictly to the left, the way the left and the right are conceived of in America. Whereas I think in Israel, there are a lot more opportunities where those labels aren't so rigid, and they don't necessarily determine whether or not we're going to use this paradigm or that paradigm. I think that you're right in terms of land, but I think there's a lot more room for use of this paradigm in different elements of both the right and the left.
Have you spoken in the territories in the Yehuda Shomron?
I have been to Shomron. I have never given a formal speech there, but but I have been there on several of my trips to Israel.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope you have a good night, and give a last thanks to Chloe. I hope that you are more than welcome to come and visit us tomorrow on College Walk. We're going to be there again for Hebrew Liberation Week, and I hope to see you all in our next events. Good night.